Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, thanks, Don. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification. I am working remotely today from my normal office, so if there's some technical glitches, I'll blame it on that. My guest today is Tom Tollerton. I do want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our resident artist, Wade Forbes, you can see on the screen, he's going to be sketchnoting the session. We're going to send that out to our audience after the event. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations seeking certification. That's primarily who we have in our audience here today. If you have some questions from the audience, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom. I'll work those into the conversation with Tom as I'm able to. I'll start with introduction of Tom. Tom Tollerton is the managing director at Dixon Hughes Goodman, where he leads their cybersecurity and data privacy consulting practices. His background is cybersecurity risk assessments, compliance assessments, and internal audit support, building on a career in IT service management at SAIC, Beals, and the state of Florida. Tom is a CMMC registered practitioner. His company, DHG, is a candidate C3 PAO. So they've been through a lot of that process of becoming ready to do CMMC assessments. Thanks for joining us today, Tom. Appreciate you being here.
Happy to be here, Ed. Thanks for having me.
So yesterday, the CMMC accreditation body had a town hall, and they released some information about what they're calling the CMMC Assessment Process, or CAP. That's been under development for some time. My understanding is that you worked on this prior under NDA as part of the training for being a provisional assessor. What is the new information that was released to the public yesterday on the CAP?
Yeah, certainly appreciate it. Yeah, certainly still under NDA as we wrap up the provisional assessor process, but I was really pleased to see the accreditation body CEO, Matt Travis, kind of start to show behind the curtain what the intention behind the assessment process is, bring some clarity, because there are rumors going around. I think there may have been an early draft that got released and just raised a lot of questions about it. But essentially the CMMC assessment process, or the CAP as that it's called, is how an assessment is to be performed end to end. So from the start, they document the expectations around how an OSC would connect with a C3PAO, an assessment company, all the way through what the report and submission of the assessment results would be to the accreditation body. That's the intention of that document.
So what's the role of that compared to the assessment guide that the DoD released? I mean, the DoD's document is about how the assessment's going to proceed. The CAP sounds like it's more of the logistics, the nuts and bolts. Can you give a little differentiation
Absolutely.
there?
Yeah, so the guidance, assessment guidance, is that nuts and bolts. How do you look at a particular requirement as an assessor? We talk about anti-malware, vulnerability scanning, those expectations in NIST 800-171. How is an assessor expected to take a look at that, and what would they look at as part of evidence and validation and so forth? The assessment process, or the CAP, is, and Matt talked about this last night, sort of a phased approach, starting with connection between an OSC and C3PAO, and then scoping. The scoping effort, which is expected to be extremely detailed and specific and highly documented, excuse me, frankly. And then it talks about the assessment, how that's conducted, the phases and so forth of that, how assessment results are to be documented. That's expected in the CAP as well. And then the submission process to the AB and EMAS, as Matt talked about last night as well.
So my understanding is that this document, one, is still under development and review by the DoD, so not finalized. And it has been released, or at least drafts have been released to yourself and other folks that have been through the provisional assessor training. Is there an intention that this is going to be published? And if so, do you have any idea when that might be?
Yeah, it's ultimately up to DoD kind of review finalization, as Matt Travis said last night. Matt did indicate, which I was glad to hear, it will be, according to him, that it will be publicly released. So it's not going to be sort of held in secret just for assessors or just for the OSCs. Anybody in the industry can get a look at it and see what the process takes.
Certainly, I think helpful as far as people trying to be ready and making sure they pass, and I'll circle back on that in a bit. in terms of how people can maximize their chances of success. But for I guess the other news from the meeting, the town hall meeting last night, was about training timelines for the certified professional credential and getting that moving now with CMMC 2.0. Is that something that is on your radar at Dixon Hughes? Is that something that you guys are working towards?
Absolutely. Yeah. When 2.0 dropped, it threw a huge wrench into the plan for the LTPs and LPPs, the training providers and the content providers. We're starting to see kind of a timeline mature around getting the Delta training from 1.0 to 2.0 for those certified professionals, those CCPs. And we're starting to hear a little bit more about when the exam may come out. Excuse me. So we expect to hear by the end of February when the exams are officially available, hopefully pretty soon thereafter. Matt Travis said last night he expects, again, still kind of waiting to hear officially from DoD on some of that documentation, that assessments should still begin in Q1. So we will need those certified professionals, those CCPs, both on staff at DHG as well as other C3PAOs and other consulting organizations that want to have CPs on staff.
So as DHG as a candidate C3PAO, you guys have gone through now the DIBCAC assessment process. Last week on this series, we had John Ellis, the head of the DIBCAC, talk about some of the things that, from the government perspective, what they're doing. My understanding is that, that with the DIBCAC assessing all the C3PAOs prior to them going out of the field and doing CMMC assessments, one of the concepts there, first of all, to vet out the assessors, but also to kind of set the bar, set the expectation. So what did you guys take away from that? What were your lessons learned during that process that you could share that maybe help the rest of us be prepared for success when we are assessed by the DIBCAC or by a C3PAO?
Yeah, and I think as some contractors, defense contractors have experienced where DIBCAC is doing assessments, is DIBCAC is pretty thorough up front, I should say. So obviously the controls assessment and assessment of requirements is pretty deep and thorough, but also scoping effort right up front. They're asking a lot of questions. They want to see documentation. That's going to be the expectation of C3PAOs as well, I think. That is fully vetted, that there is agreement from assessors and the OSCs as to what the scope is, I would expect that to be documented as part of as part of the assessment and what is ultimately submitted to the AB. I would probably expect that. So it's not a piece of paper sort of certification. I think you and I talked. I described it as roll down your window and they'll throw a certification in your car. It is going to be pretty in depth.
So, and for anybody who missed Jeff Ellis' conversation last week, who missed this program, it's on our website. You can go back and see it on demand, but it was pretty interesting. He gave a lot of insight into, sort of what the DoD is hoping to accomplish with those assessments, and also the coordination that they're doing to keep those assessments consistent across DIBCAC, C3PAOs, et cetera. So, so I think that sounds like there's a lot of heads up work going on by the government for sure. Did you guys change, or did it help shape your approach to assessments, what you experienced with the DIBCAC? I mean, were there things there where you're like, oh, okay, we got to rethink this or do it in a certain way to kind of match the expectation there?
I don't think so. I think what is probably unique with CMMC relative to other frameworks, which you're certainly familiar with, PCI, ISO, just the system security plan, I think was really a key right up front. So ISO has the has a documentation requirement, control documentation requirement right up front. But the system security plan is one of the earliest things that any assessor is going to take a look at. I mean, and that's to be expected. We know that from guidance as it is today, but clearly documenting what is in place so an assessor can decide, all right, you know what, I think you're ready to move forward versus maybe not quite ready to move forward. Documentation, having that tight is key right up front.
The other thing that is important up front is the scoping and making sure that there's an understanding of what's being assessed, right? So help us understand the role of the C3PAO in that scoping. So it's important that the organization that's getting certified and the C3PAO agree it's ultimately up to the organization to define what their scope is. Where is government data? Where is CUI? Where is FCI? What's the role of the C3PAO in terms of that agreement and then invalidating the scope and boundary that's put forth by the OSC?
I think an agreement, the CMMC process, which we've known for some time, follows sort of a high trust model or an ISO model where there are third-party assessors out there doing these assessments, and DHG hopes to be one fairly soon. But our results are then submitted to a third-party certification body, which in this case is the accreditation body. So when we talk about making sure that we're in agreement, the assessor needs to follow what will be pretty strict scoping guidance as it's anticipated. So because we are submitting the results of our assessment to somebody else. And so there is the potential for our findings or our scoping effort to come into question. So it's really important for an assessor right up front, as we kind of talked about, to dig into scoping pretty early so that there aren't surprises later on that could potentially cause an assessor to need to walk away or to rework the timeline, et cetera. I think that the scoping is going to be key.
So what if there's a disagreement there, right? What if you're having that discussion and the boundary is too porous, too ill-defined? In other words, you don't feel like the organization has really followed the scoping guide. How does that get resolved? So they present it to you. You say, hey, we just don't agree with this. What's the resolution process there?
Well, if it's a simple disagreement, they think they're ready and we think they're not, I would, in any framework, just kind of walk away, step back, frankly, and just say, okay, you're not, if you want us to do your assessment, we can't call this a readiness assessment, so we can't give you recommendations just from an independent standpoint. But I would say revisit it. These are the areas that we initially find concern with from a scoping standpoint. Go back and work with your consulting provider, your IT service provider, and just work through that. If it's that sort of a disagreement. If we just need to have conversation and dig in a little bit deeper, there could be a lot of back and forth, I think, between OSCs and C3PAOs as part of this. We'll see. I think there's a lot to be determined because we are still waiting on the cap. We are still waiting on final scoping and assessment guidance. And we, of course, have not started any assessments as C3PAOs. So I think there's a lot to be determined, but I think trying to make sure as an OSC, the folks on this webinar feel really good about scoping and not just, hey, we've got, this checkbox sort of approach.
I mean, to take that a little bit further, in a case where a C3PAO feels that the organization they're assessing maybe has misinterpreted not just the scoping, but some of the requirements, the organization is going to say, hey, I believe I fully met this. And as a C3PAO, you disagree. And ultimately, your finding is the one that counts, right? Do you feel that C3PAO has a role in those kind of questions of interpretation? In other words, if the organization says, here's how I interpreted it, here's how I believe it applies to me, and here's my evidence, do you have a role to sort of debate that with them? How does that work?
Yeah, that's again, this is me thinking. There is nothing official about this, but I do anticipate, certainly from a risk to our organization as an assessment company, we're going to push back, right, on some disagreements. And there may be scenarios where we just completely disagree on things. And again, this early in a framework that's fairly new, that could come to pass. At the same time, I think it's in everybody's interest to try to work together and make sure that scoping is clear. The borders are very brightly lit from a technology, people, process perspective. And try and find the right solution, whatever that is, whether that's just, going back to the drawing board on scoping, whether that's, further clarification, communication, whatever it is. I think it's going to be a collaborative approach. And I think the accreditation body wants it to be.
That's cool. We had Matt Travis from the AB on the CEO of the AB on this program, and he talked about the possibility, or sort of his recommendation, that we have a government-run help desk that would offer some authoritative guidance, right? Somebody that you could go to within the DoD and ask them these kind of questions, so that at least then the organizations seeking certification and the C3PAO are hearing the same guidance from the same party, Is that something that, well, it was speculative on his part. He wasn't saying there had been one decided, right? Just that he thought it was going to be necessary. Is that a concept you'd support?
I do find that interesting, and that's it's one of the things I really love about Matt is he's very creative and pretty on fire for this. So that's a great idea. I do think that the AB, as the certification issuing body here, does have the responsibility to be the ultimate authority on the certification itself. And at the same time, if it's a matter of trying to meet a particular requirement in NIST 800-171, we can't have all the C3PAOs going to Department of Defense directly. That would just be a deluge on them. So having that kind of centralized channel of authority, even as an independent third party, I think is certainly a good thing.
We'll see how it shakes out. And there has been, that's been, I think, a little bit of speculation on whether the AB will play in that role. They're not authoritative, right? They can give an interpretation. They're going to review your results, as you talked about earlier, but at the end of the day, the DoD is authoritative on questions of scope and applicability and that sort of thing. So, being able to resolve that, at the DoD CIO level is kind of how it's done today under the current standards. But I wouldn't say it's a help desk, right? But there are ways to get some advice there. So shifting gears a little bit, we've had a bunch of conversation on this series about some of the reasons that DIB members might seek voluntary assessments from a C3PAO. So, the DoD has teased out some possible incentives to try to get people to get certified ahead of a contractual requirement. We've seen contractors talk about business benefits, competitive advantage, and that sort of thing. Some people even talking about the idea that self-assessments, doing them every year versus a C3PAO assessment every 3 years, it might be cost effective to do the every 3-year deal. Even though you're paying an outside party. Are you guys seeing demand? I mean, again, this is ahead of the curve here, but are you seeing demand already stacking up for assessments ahead of it being a formal contractual requirement?
Yeah, frankly, it's across the board for us. We have a number of, as we top 20 public accounting firm, we have a very large government contracting services group that we serve contractors across the country. So we have a number of clients who are very proactive. They value their contract, they value their defense work, and they do want to get in front of it. And so we're having conversations with them. What would it look like to do an assessment with them, and timeline, et cetera. So we are having a lot of conversation there, and we've got a number of folks that we've talked to that are still kind of understandably in the wait and see mode too. They just want to see this flesh out. Okay, well, we may be able to do a self-assessment. We think we can do that, and understandably that may be the case. So it kind of depends, quite frankly.
What of the people who are saying they want to do a third-party assessment, what are the drivers? What are the things they're telling you? Are there business reasons for wanting to do that, other than we expect it to be a requirement?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say incentives at this point because we haven't seen them. No one's mentioned we want to get in front of this in case they're really nice incentives. But competitive advantage is big in a number of industries, manufacturing, distribution. We've kind of seen that. Manufacturers that distribute to Department of Defense, they kind of want to get this done as a differentiator. So that I would say is number one. A couple of organizations we're talking to, they know the importance of protecting information. They don't like seeing the headlines. They don't like seeing companies in the headlines. A Colonial Pipeline, for example, they don't want to be that down the road. So they want to get in front of this as quickly as possible to show that they've done their due diligence. And then I think the False Claims Act. I mean, they do want to have that third party objective perspective in the form of certification here, if only from a risk management perspective. They want to make sure they've done their diligence to avoid any sort of False Claims Act. I think there are going to be a lot of executives paying attention to now that they have to sign any sort of self-assessment result. That's giving them a little bit of pause that, hey, maybe we need to bring in some sort of a third party, whether it's an advisor, whether it's to do a third party certification. That's another, call it, incentive as well.
That's an interesting one, and I think the competitive advantage is the one we hear the most. But this idea that it's basically cheap insurance for the CEO who has to sign an attestation, right? That he's had a third party tell him, "You're good, man. We checked, and you're good according to the criteria established by the government."
Yeah, I got to be careful. I mean, those certifications, they aren't an automatic. Obviously, they don't automatically define security. But yes, you know, just if I'm a CEO of a mid-sized company and I could do a self-assessment, but I don't really know down the chain what my IT department looks like, what they're doing. I don't feel comfortable signing off on this or having one of my VPs sign off on this. Yeah, they're just having that third parties, you know, specialization around security, around CMMC come in and help or do a certification assessment. I think is going to be a preference for executives.
I would think. So one of the keys to controlling the cost of compliance is being well prepared, making sure that when you bring an assessor in, for example, that you're ready to go, ready to succeed the first time. You know, it's a formal affair. You mentioned earlier, detail oriented, right? There's a lot of this. It's a very rigorous process. So as contractors are starting to feel that they're ready, they've got their controls in place, they've checked against the standard, they feel like they're doing okay. How do they know when it's the right time to call for a certification assessment? Like, how do you avoid bringing in an assessor too early and then stumbling over failures you didn't know about?
No, I talked about documentation earlier. Just working with government, I would anticipate that documentation is going to be a big deal. So that system security plan that you mentioned, maybe having the requirements met. If you're going to do a certification with a third party, I would make sure that my system security plan is pretty thorough and documented, supporting policies and procedures and standards and so forth. I do think there's a lot of value in working even before a certification with a third party consulting firm or maybe another assessor for a little pre-assessment work, working with, you know, IT managed service providers that are providing CMMC compliant solutions at NeoSystems, for example. I mean, I think you guys are way in front of it. So I think, you know, you're bringing a lot of value to the table from the CMMC perspective. I think even before having the third party certification, having another objective third party, call it opinion or perspective, I think is helpful.
So one of the things in terms of making sure that we're focused on the right things, you mentioned security a while back in this thing, and that sometimes gets lost as we think about certification and compliance and all that, right? So DoD has emphasized from day one that they don't intend CMMC to be just a checklist, but you know, the checklist mentality is a risk of any compliance framework. Anytime you put an objective standard out there, people are going to work to meet that standard. They got to pass the assessment. They got to pass the certification. So how should business leaders, security practitioners, how should we be thinking about CMMC and the broader issues of cyber risk so as to steer clear from just sort of mindless checking of boxes and really make sure that what we're doing is effective in deterring our adversaries? Like, how do we get past the certification but still keep security front and center like it should be?
Yeah, I think the potential litigation, I mentioned the False Claims Act earlier. I mean, you may be able to check the box and sort of get that certification, that piece of paper, if you will. There we call it that. The FTC and other industries is starting to pay attention to, you know, are they really doing it, or are they just kind of showing that they're doing it? I do think that's a bit of a risk here, especially if certification is going to be something required every 3 years. You know, we see it in PCI, we see it in, you know, other frameworks just that are annual. You know, we'll get the assessment done, we'll get the certification, the attestation of compliance, and we'll kind of fall off and then expect the following year for the assessor to come in and redo it. I don't know that there's an easy answer to that question. I think as a result, potentially of leveraging third-party specialists, again, like a NeoSystems, I think you're putting yourself in trusted hands of specialists. So instead of me trying to operate my server room, my data center, whatever you want to call it, you know, at Bassett, NeoSystems, whoever, you know, is working on this, thinking about it 24 hours a day, I think that is going to be a great outcome of this, where we're leveraging the security expertise versus trying to handle it maybe at a lower level.
You mentioned 3 years. 3 years is an awful long time in the security world, right? And a lot changes from an IT. Companies grow, things happen, the threat changes. So as you're in there as an assessor, looking at a company, knowing you're not going to be back again for 3 years, we've taken in CMMC 2.0, we've taken away the maturity requirement, right? There's a formal requirement to assess maturity is now gone. But how are you looking to see if it's likely that that system's going to stay in a compliant state. Like, what are you looking at? What are you looking for? Is that even part of your decision whether to certify or not at this point under on 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, we've got this in a number of areas. You know, we call it in our industry auditor's judgment. I mean, we're going to have to get just a reasonable level of assurance, sort of, to use another accounting phrase, where we just, you know, for something that may not necessarily need to demonstrate maturity, we do want to get comfort that this is not something that's just been checked, you know, right before we came in the door, that there has been something previous. There may not be clear expectations to look back a full year or 6 months or whatever it is, but you know, I always look for a certain level of maturity in operation of a particular control or requirement, just to make sure we're, you know, apples to apples with what we're being told.
I mean, a SOC audit, for example, you're looking back at the history over an audit period, and you're attesting that you have seen evidence that the controls were in place during that entire period. With CMMC, really trying to say, is it likely that these controls will be in place tomorrow? I mean, that's more of the question, right? I mean, if you're supposed to be, you know, encrypting CUI, it's not, did I encrypt it last year? It's do I encrypt it next year, the next 3 years, right?
Well, sort of point in time with like a PCI, sort of as of the report on compliance date for that particular assessment. That's what we're looking at. I would anticipate CMMC again to continue to evolve. I think we'll start to look at, you know, as we get years down the road here, we want validation that we, I mean, the DoD and the accreditation body and the security industry would expect to see that, you know, there are things happening over time. You know, PCI requires quarterly external vulnerability scans for credit card data security, et cetera. So I think we'll start to see those maturity requirements sort of creep back in as CMMC matures.
And we've heard some of that from the folks that are in the standards making business too, right? So that tying it to 171 is not a static document. It's expected to change and evolve as the threat changes. So I think you're right. I think we all expect some of that. So we're getting close to the end of our time. I'll just ask a wrap-up question. This is about resource allocation and making sure that for the efforts that we're putting forth, all of us in the DIB, that we're getting the best results from our efforts. So as you talk to companies that are looking to unpack CMMC and sort out what they're going to do in response, some of those are doing brilliant things. Some of them are getting caught in technical or regulatory rabbit holes that maybe aren't a good use of their time. What's sort of your one piece, as you've talked to people and seen what they're working on and what they're not working on, what's your one piece of advice you can offer that would help us stay focused and make the most progress where it has the most impact on security, protecting us against our adversaries?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe multiple prong. We've alluded to some of it. I mean, I think the readiness assessment work right up front. I mean, be honest with yourself with what you're doing as an OSE organization seeking certification. You know, if you can do it, be honest with yourself about it and do it. If not, reach out to a consultant or leverage your third-party MSP. And then I would anticipate documentation expectations. I mean, when we had our assessment with DIBCAC, they asked for everything we had right up front from a documentation standpoint. And if that wasn't in a solid state, I anticipate that our full assessment probably would not have moved forward. So that would be I think a key is to have the documentation ready to roll, make sure it's thorough, make sure it's accurate and complete. Just right up front, I think that's going to be successful or lead to a successful assessment moving forward.
Tom, I appreciate it. Thanks very much. And thanks to Wade for sketching this. We'll send that out to folks after the session here today. Thanks to you in the audience for your time and attention today. I very much appreciate it. I trust this was some useful insight and guidance into sort of the nuts and bolts of the CMMC assessment process in particular. Please join us for future town hall meetings. We're going to skip next week because our team, the NeoSystems team, is presenting at the National 8A Association Conference. So if you are in the small business world, please look at that. But we'll be back in 2 weeks. Our next session will be February 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern, our usual time. If you don't have the details in your inbox, please go to our website, neosystemscorp.com, for the details. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.